Hello, this is Dr. Heather Lee, and this is an instructional segment on response to intervention for EDS 318 at Nyack College. And we have spent quite a bit of time in this course talking about student diversity and how our perspective as teachers should be to study our students, to learn how they're unique, and to specifically use those things in order to help them succeed. Well, we're going to shift gears now and talk about how we do that. How the government has proposed that we do that, how schools typically do that, and some ideas for you as a teacher in an individual classroom, how you can best meet the needs. And this section, Response to Intervention, is specifically focusing on how to meet the needs of struggling learners in our classrooms. Now, to get a little background on this Response to Intervention, or RTI, it is, those words, Response to Intervention, come from something that the government wrote when they reauthorized IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Educational Act, in 2004. And this new law had a big switch in how students basically were identified for special services or for special education. This is how it used to be, the old model. And the way it's said is a discrepancy between students' achievement and intellectual ability might lead to special education evaluation. In other words, a student would be tested, and a student who wasn't doing well, and we would find out their intellectual ability, and often IQ is part of that testing. And then if a student for a certain amount of time continued to not do well in the classroom, but we know that they can, but for some reason they're not. Their intellectual ability seems to show they can do it, but for some reason they're not able to succeed. Then they would be referred to special education. And a problem with that is that it sometimes took quite a while for a student to get to that special education evaluation. First, they really had to do very poorly for quite a bit of time, often with more than one teacher. And so that led to a long road to special education evaluation. And this new model, beginning with this 2004 reauthorization, said that instead, at the first earliest time that we think a student is struggling, instead of waiting for them to fail and waiting for the system to show that they're not doing well, instead the teacher right away begins to try things in her classroom. And along with good teaching, the teacher specifically tries to target that student. And depending on how the student responds, they would get to more intense intervention until maybe they have to be referred for special education. But a teacher and a school do a lot before they get referred for that special education. So there was a change in the way that students were evaluated for special education, and it has a lot of implications in our classroom nowadays. Now, this change represents a few things. First of all, a prevention model. In other words, we're going to prevent students from getting behind. We're going to prevent them from going down a long road of failure before they get identified for special education. So we're trying to have a prevention model instead of a failure model. Another thing that this response to intervention is designed to counter is the fact that in special education programs, we found that many minorities and English language learners were included in special education. And it was disproportionate. In other words, proportionally more minorities and ELL students ended up in special education than Caucasian students. And that shows us that that teachers were essentially assuming that someone with ELL might have a learning disability, and they were more likely to refer them. Or someone who was a minority was more likely to have a learning disability and referred them quicker. And that is unfair to them. It doesn't give them, a teacher maybe didn't take as much opportunity and time with those students as they should have, instead quickly referred them to special education. And one of the ways that the new legislation has us focus on students is that they are considered general education students before they're considered LD students or learning disabled students. We do everything we can to try to keep them in the regular classroom with a regular teacher before we have to send them elsewhere or do something extra for them. So let's go on to talk about what is RTI, response to intervention. First of all, it's a framework, not a model. And what that means is that it doesn't tell a school or a teacher exactly what to do, like you have to do step A, step B, step C, but instead it's a framework. It's kind of a big picture for how you should handle this kind of situation. And that framework is kind of what I've described before, that first the classroom teacher tries as hard as he or she can to intervene, to make systematic changes, and to work with this student. And we continue to get more and more interventions, more and more intense, until then finally they may need to be referred to special education if they're still not succeeding. So we follow that framework, but different schools, different states, different classrooms may implement it in different ways. Often it's a 3-tier model, and we're going to look at that next. And each time, each part of this model is a different type of intervention. And so we watch the students and their response to intervention, hence the term RTI. The student's response is evaluated, and that's how we decide whether we need to get more intense with the interventions or whether that intervention worked and we're okay. So we're always studying the student's response and how they're doing and whether we have achieved the goal. Now, this 3-tier model, this is a model. This is a way that some schools or some school districts, this is the most popular way that many have implemented it. But this is not the way you have to. Schools might do it in a very different way. But a lot of them have chosen this 3-tier model. And let's take a look at it. You need to be familiar with this model. The first tier, Tier 1, this is in the regular classroom. This is when a classroom teacher sees that a student may have a difficulty and she does everything that she can for that student. It begins with excellent quality teaching. And she also, or he also, includes differentiated strategies where she would try different things for different students, different types of learners, and look to see whether that is successful. And in this Tier 1, the student stays in the same general education classroom, and it's believed that 80% of students could succeed in a regular classroom and don't need any other additional help if it's a good quality teacher with good quality instruction who differentiates and also uses flexible grouping, just good strategies that we've learned about in education. Now, if Tier 1 is not working and a student is still struggling, then we would move up to Tier 2 in this particular model. Now, Tier 2 might still be in the regular classroom setting, but it's that the teacher is more focused and does something involving maybe a small group setting where she works with the 3 or 4 students who are struggling the most. Maybe she talks with somebody in her building and gets some more specialized ideas for how to help this student. Or in some schools, Tier 2 might involve someone coming into the classroom to help with a small group of students. Or maybe they go out for just a little bit and get some specialized help. So Tier 2 can be flexible, different schools do different things, but it's more intense. And 10 to 15% of students who wouldn't succeed in Tier 1 should be able to succeed in Tier 2. But if Tier 2 still is not effective, then we would move on to Tier 3. And this is an even more intense model. This is where a student may leave the classroom for parts of the time or for longer in their subject areas where they are struggling. And they would get even more intense, smaller groups, longer amount of times, in addition to what they're already getting in the regular classroom, and sometimes even individualized help in Tier 3. And it's believed that of those who wouldn't succeed in Tier 2, that 10 to 12% would be able to succeed in these ones. Now, if Tier 1, 2, and 3 interventions still don't work, then a student may be referred to a special education evaluated and may eventually need to not be in a regular classroom. But we do as much as we can beforehand to help them in a regular classroom. So that is a 3-tier model that you do need to be familiar with. Now, some key principles involving response to intervention. First of all, it's high quality core instruction. That's what we talked about in Tier 1, that a teacher is teaching very well, research-based teaching techniques that work and that have proven to help with student intervention. Another key principle is universal screening. What that means is that instead of a teacher selecting who they think maybe should be screened for extra help or for extra, everybody gets screened. That way a teacher is not discriminating. That way someone who maybe is a quiet student and reserved and holds back but really does have a learning problem, they're not eliminated from screening because the teacher misses it. So everybody gets screened. And then everyone is monitored along the way. There's continued evaluation, continued assessment that is looked at beyond that initial screening to see, are the students succeeding? Then there are tiered interventions, like we talked about, interventions that get more and more intense with smaller and smaller groups of students. And then finally, data-based decision making. And what we mean by that is that we get real research-based principles, and we get real data, real assessment scores, not just, I think this is working, maybe sort of, or I'll try this. But we really use hard, cold facts to help make those decisions. Now, at the high school level, response to intervention looks different than at the elementary level. At the elementary level, it's used quite a bit for reading, for literacy, for language-related areas, and it often works with that tiered model. But the high school model often looks different. First of all, it's often used with the younger high school students, often 9th and 10th graders, for English and math, the core subject areas, or possibly for English language learners. And in that, the Tier 2 is usually still within the same classroom. You have large groups, but also small groups in a classroom where a teacher would help target the needs of certain students. And then the Tier 3 and sometimes Tier 2, again, different districts may make different decisions and do things in various ways. But that third tier, or maybe the second one, is a separate class period. So instead of maybe band or art, maybe an elective, these students might go to an additional reading class, or they might go to a small group math class, or an English instruction class, something that helps them to target in a smaller group more effectively to their needs. And also at the high school level, compared to the elementary level, the student is also involved in the decision makings because we want the students to be motivated, to have some ownership in what's going on with them and how they learn and what needs they have. And it's been found that the students can give some good ideas and help towards a better design for their RTI. And students are likely to be more committed to the process if they have been involved in the decision making. Now at the high school level, certainly some things are needed. You have to get real creative with scheduling at times. And at the high school level, it's very rare that a student will be recommended for special education through this RTI method. And that's usually because students are referred at much younger ages, usually in elementary school. And we've talked about the fact that this would vary significantly by school, how they might run their RTI program. And typically it follows a problem-solving model. And in our next instructional video, I'm going to talk about what that problem-solving model looks like for most high schools. Thank you very much.